Entry mode activated. Target acquired.
Hey there, hunters. Welcome back to the Gunners Guild, which will become relevant, I swear. So previously in our Stories 2 discussions, we had talked about monster cores that work really well together, like, Parapoison to support Status Chaser on Hammer, Duo Zenogre crit core coverage, and then the Dread Queen Self Bomber. A lot of highly offensive stuff, to be honest, but now we're going to slow down and step back and kind of talk about the defensive options. Now, surprisingly, stall and tanky setups are kind of the true PvP meta right now, not hyper offensive teams like you might think. The whole point is to just absorb as much damage as possible with your monstie and then use the hunter with greatsword to build up your charges so you can AoE down the whole team. Or use kinship with Popo and Aptonoth to force them to all get toppled, which will give you 100% crit, which pretty much means you're game over. Defensive skills like All Res and Iron Wall do a flat 50 and 35 defense, which are great because you're scaled down to level 50 in PvP. And I mean, all that stuff is all dandy, and that's the PvP meta, but we're going to be discussing defensive options on the PvE side, which is going to be a little bit different. So there are a lot of defensive monsters you can use as a base. Nergigante stands out as because he's basically the best monster in the game. He sports amazing defenses, a great attack, HP, best recovery stat, which is important for healing. Now, everything else is pretty much lackluster compared to Nerg, but we do have some honorable mentions. Black Gravios has better HP and fire defense, but lower everything else. Popodrome has better HP, but that's about it. Dread Queen is pretty solid and tanky as well. And Kushala Deora has pretty stellar stats defensively as well. The problem with Kushala and Popo are the fact that they're weak to fire and thunder, which are very common in strong offensive types. So the two monsters I'm going to use obviously are Kushala and Popo, as you can see from the clips and stuff. Not because they're the best tanks, far from it, since they're weak to like really common attack types, so because I don't really have ice monsters on my team, and they seem pretty off meta, so I'm still going to be doing that thing. Anyway, Kushala and Popo are fairly tanky on paper, but as you can see from base stats from similarly leveled monsters, it doesn't make that much of a difference. Their stats aren't that much higher than other monsters, so you can technically make a defensive monster out of anything you want. Now, before we start slapping on all those defensive ups genes on your monsters, let me just stop you right there and say that it's a huge trap. You can see the difference on my elemental defense when I have like all defense up with 2 stars and without it. It's like 35 defense, which is pretty awful when you're like scaling past level 50s. A lot of modifiers in this game are flat values rather than percentage based, so as you go higher up in value, stuff scales really awkwardly. Genes that do passive bonuses like all out, defense up, HP up, your elemental attack ups are all flat values. So in the end, it becomes better just to scale like bingo, since those are all percentages. But anyway, enough about that. Let's just get back to defensive topics really quick. There's a couple core defensive skills that you should have on your monsters, and that's basically evasion boost and divine protection. Evasion has the chance to completely ignore an attack, which is huge, and then divine blessing has a chance to take half damage, which is also big mitigation. Self heal is kind of cool, but also not. I thought it had scaled recovery stat on the monsters, but apparently it doesn't, and it's always a flat 40 per turn, which isn't the worst thing in the world, especially if you're doing PvP, but it's by no means mandatory for PvE. I have it on my popodrome because I use Emerald Conchala skill to basically take no damage for a turn and then heal that off, so I can't really be chipped down slowly, and that kind of works out. It's also really good if you want to mitigate poisons, burns, and cyclone damage as well. Honey Power is actually the better option to sustain healing, surprisingly. It scales off the recovery stat of your monsters like Nergigante and Popodrome. I mean, they could just heal big chunks with it. And fully upgraded it lasts 5 turns, and I'm kind of mixed on it though. It's good, but I hate spending a turn to set it up. But yeah, it's a good healing option. Now, anti-status chain is also nice since it's a 35% chance to ignore any status compared to the very specific genes, which are 100. I would say it's not really mandatory either. I don't really run it on my Kushala, but it's nice to avoid skill seals and paralysis without eating up 2 genes. So I mean, it's a good skill, just again, not mandatory. So you're starting to see, it is actually kind of rather difficult to make something passively tanky, so don't rely on like your passive genes to hold up your monster. I find the best skills to make a tanky monster are Conchala's guard skill. While it doesn't completely avoid attacks like Nargacuga's evasion, it does last the whole turn, so you can take multiple hits. This also does let status come through though, unfortunately, which is why status res is still kind of useful, as is self-healing like I mentioned earlier. Obviously Nargacuga has evasion to completely avoid attacks, and there are some armor skills to buff your defenses, but that's pretty much it. Other than those, there's not much else you can do to make a particularly tanky monster. Okay, so I talked a lot about genes and skills. Let's discuss what my Kushala and popodrome are doing. Popodrome, straight tank. The whole goal is for this thing to not die like ever. Our active defensive skills are snow armor, which is a 5-turn buff for 30% more elemental defense, which is fantastic, and perfect guard from Conchala to absorb hits as basically as long as I can because it only costs 11 meters. Passively, we have evasion, divine protection, and status negation and self heal. Like I mentioned earlier, this is all just kind of so he can take off all that chip, so hopefully the perfect guard sustains him. I also gave it an ice attack for each of the attack types, tech, power, and speed, so it can deal with head-to-heads and not get slapped too hard there. Ultimately, popodromes shouldn't die if used properly, plus the hunter can just pet and guard too, so yeah, bring them on. Popodrome doesn't really have bingo setup though, because it's not really meant to do any damage, and while it still hits hard enough, it's not really going to win a fight against any monster through sheer brute force. It's just not happening. Plus, this thing is slow as dirt. Ultimately, nothing really surprising here, just a big beefy popo. So let's move on to Kushala. Now Kushala is innately pretty tanky, but I threw on the standard divine protection and evasion as well. But this Kushala's job is to support the hunter, and more than it is to just absorb damage and tank. So because of that, it has soul kinship to boost meter gain, as well as head-to-head master to increase meter gain when you win head-to-heads. With these two skills, I basically have full meter gain instantly, so I can go into riding or buffing. Kushala has one attack type for each skill as well, so I can win those head-to-heads, and each has a specific role to play. Now, Ice Troll's there because it causes skill steal on monsters and can ruin their turns, which is great, but as well as being the only ice attack that really has any damage and can crit, so if a monster gets toppled, I can still do some backup damage that way. Thousand Blades is our go-to for bleed, and bleed basically will get eaten by the hunter to do double damage, which is great. Bleed is crazy strong. And then we have Thunderbug Blitz for paralysis to give me even more of a chance to avoid hits. Though you have to be careful here, because a paired monster can't do head-to-head, so you're going to be missing out on meter gain. Make sure you know when to paralyze the monster. And then lastly, we have Merciless Roar for an entire party damage buff. It's a 5-turn, 30% damage buff. It's really nice. So you can kind of see what Kushala is all about. Evade attacks, apply status, support the hunter, try not to die. It's not the uber tanky turtle setup like popodrome is, but it gets the job done. Now these setups can also easily be moved to other monsters like Nergigante, Black Ravios, Dread Queen, and all that stuff depending on what resistances you need, but I like these monsters, so that's what I'm going with for now. But anyway, that's basically all for me, so thank you all for watching and good luck out there, hunters.